Hi, and welcome back to part two of our study on rationalism and empiricism. Uh, Please forgive me, my laptop ran out of hard drive space, so here we are with part two. Okay, so in the second half here, we're going to be talking about someone that is basically the opposite of Descartes as a rationalist, and that is Francis Bacon, who was considered an empiricist. And he too was a well rounded individual. He was a philosopher, statesman, scientist, a jurist, a speaker as well. And his work was very influential. And what was his work? His work was the scientific method. And the scientific method is something that is very similar to Descartes in the sense that it is a sort of a conceptual and methodological tool for, in this case, conducting science. Right? So he was an advocate and practitioner of this scientific method. And he was smart enough not to dispense with Descartes altogether, because Bacon also believed that you could still use skeptical doubt and a more methodical approach in order to conduct science, right? And if you could do this, be both skeptical and methodical, you can also minimize doubt, which was the whole reason for being for the Cartesian method, right? This deductive method. So, while Descartes could be considered the father of modern rationality, Bacon is considered the father of empiricism. I apologize for the metaphors of fathers rather than mothers, but that's unfortunately the situation in history at this particular time. So, Bacon is talking about a kind of scientific knowledge that's based not on intellectual deduction, but instead on inductive reasoning and careful observation of events. So again, as I've been stressing all along, there's no such thing as a pure empiricist, or in fact a pure rationalist either. There are combinations, but it's not 50-50. It's like 70-30 kind of thing. But Bacon was able to use skepticism and doubt and rigorous critical studies in order to still create the kind of science that could, as I said, minimize doubt. So, in the way in which Descartes could take an idea and whittle it down to its single absolute entity, in his case, I think, therefore I am, Bacon worked the other way. He worked inductively, and he worked really hard to establish a single premise before moving on to more careful observation of the real world. So, that's kind of the way he worked. So he was preoccupied with philosophy and science and combining these two, and he too made that decisive break with Aristotle. And what Bacon did was he was using the same process of deduction, but moving in a different direction, right? Moving from the single to the general. With Descartes, it was the other way around, right? To start from the general to the specific. So Bacon also was very concerned with applying radical doubt to make sure that we are not deluded into believing something that may not be there. So we don't want to be led astray through illusion, through a rhetorical device that gives us the same results over and over again. No, instead, we need to confront, right? Confront those things that we experience in order to test them. So we confront the various obstacles towards knowledge. And of course, at this particular time, false appearances. Here's Bacon, an empiricist, saying, yes, we can have false readings. We can have false appearances. We can be deluded and we can suffer from illusions of one sort or another. But we need to make sure that we are critical and rigorous in our scientific testing. And if we can do that, we're less likely to make mistakes. So Bacon's empirical philosophy, rather than rational philosophy, was evident in the various fields in which he wrote. He wrote about science, he wrote about religion, literary matters, juridical matters, about law, some of the really intelligent ideas about the way in which people have preconceptions bordering on superstitions come from Bacon. And I will look at this in a moment. So his three main ideas were science, religion, and literary works, and in law, right? These very important aspects of everyday life. The big book for Bacon, like Descartes' Discourse on Method, Bacon's Novum Organum, right? The New Science. That was the book that really put him on the map. Very influential with writers of the 1600s. scientific scholars, philosophers as well. And Bacon, being a kind of a common sense sort of guy, was considered a sort of guiding spirit during the Royal Society. Now, the Royal Society is a group of scientists and thinkers and writers who came together after the very disruptive Civil War that occurred earlier in the 1600s that split England apart over religious matters, religious persecution, and legal and political issues, all boiled over into an absolute mess that became a civil war. And to the point where Charles I was beheaded and Oliver Cromwell took over. And Oliver Cromwell was not even a monarch. He was an army, like a leader of the army. And basically this was a draconian, terrifying time in England. Theater was closed down. Literature was closed down. It was basically everyone being virtuous and if not, you were going to suffer from, as a result of misbehaving, often be put to death. It was a very horrible, draconian kind of world. So after the Civil War was over, and after Cromwell was overthrown by Charles II, of course, Charles II had hightailed it to Scotland to wait it out, comes back. And so Bacon is this guiding light as people are re-energized by science, by literature, by poetry, by beauty, by art. And Bacon is this common sense figure that really helps everyone to galvanize these ideas around, a central idea of just common sense. And for Bacon, a common sense approach was a non-metaphysical approach to science. And yet what's really interesting, even in France in the 1700s, Bacon was actually more popular than Descartes. Descartes may have created this sort of method of radical doubt, but in terms of practicality and common sense, but practicality more so, Bacon seemed to have won the order of the day. He seemed to be the father of the kind of scientific method that really ended up being much more pervasive. More people were going to use a scientific method than they were to use the Cartesian method. It's one thing to strip away the elements that could be doubted, but where do you go from there? And this is why Descartes' writings, as important as they are, really sort of focus on one small thing, which is finding some sort of absolute truth. Even if it's only one thing, I think, therefore I am. That's great. But the problem is, if you're looking around in the world and all you see is your own self as the only possible certainty, you're going to run into problems. Right? That's not a common sense approach. So as a result, and by contrast, Bacon's non-metaphysical approach to science became much more popular even in France, for sure in England as well. So new instruments of science, or new science, is a reference to Aristotle's earlier work, organon. And an organon is a kind of a foundational tool, right? It's a means by which to do something. And so Bacon had worked out in the new instrument of science a new system of logic that he thought was more effective, more common sense, more scientific. And the result was using inductive reasoning to start with a fact and move out, rather than spending a lot of time and energy stripping everything away to end up really where you need to start. So that's another reason why the Cartesian method was ultimately frustrating. Bacon starts with where Descartes ends. You strip away doubt until the one sort of known thing, and Bacon goes, well, why don't we start with the known thing and work from there? So the scientific method is inductive. It starts with a single phenomena, a single element, tries to prove its veracity, its truthfulness, its reality, before moving on to the next step. And it's done through experimentation. So natural phenomena could be induced, right, by examining situations where such phenomena may be absent elsewhere. And if they are, what are the reasons? What are the causes, the variations, the degrees of similarity to difference? All of this is done scientifically, rigorously, using logic. And it's not sloppy science. It's quite the opposite. It's very rigorous science, but it is a science that starts with a fact and moves out. So Bacon's work is fundamental, right, in the history of science, and especially as science comes back, because if you think about it, science essentially disappears with Aristotle. With Aristotle as a biologist and somewhat of a physicist, the scientific method really dies with it, or it dies with Aristotle, because the post-Aristotelian thinkers are more concerned with virtue and ethics and morality and ways of being, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Epicureans, and the scientific method really disappears for almost 1,500 years, and only around this time does it come back. So Bacon's work is absolutely crucial to the reestablishment of science, and specifically the scientific method, right, this inductive method. So the focus is on experimental research, observation, more research, more testing, more observation. And that's why science can say that it doesn't have the truth, it's a capital T, but has a pretty damn good idea of what's going on. But they're always willing to change until new data comes in. Then the ideas will be as such, as we saw with the pandemic. When we think going back 2 years ago, we really didn't know what it was. In science, we were asking science, please, what is this? How does it reproduce? Why is it so dangerous? Why are some people catching it and not others? And not only that, but within a year and a bit, we ended up coming up with a vaccine for it. That is absolutely remarkable. It's just not something that happens. But the science needed to be redone and rethought and recalculated all along the way. Because imagine if we had etched in stone our first impressions of COVID-19. Well, guess what? We're not moving any further because we want to adhere to this. This is what we need to look for. No, Bacon would have been rolling in his grave. Instead, he said, no, experiment, research, observe, continue to experiment, continue to observe, and keep on working. Always try to perfect it using this scientific method. And so Bacon is considered the father of the scientific method because of the way in which he presented it to us. That yes, you can use radical doubt, you can be skeptical, but you can also be critical and rigorous and logical in order to find something that is pretty solid, right? Not an absolute truth with a capital T, but pretty solid. And that was an approach that was counter to previous methods that may exploit a natural bias or weaknesses in the human mind, and something that Descartes really never considered. He stripped back radical doubt, but ultimately, unless you psychoanalyze yourself, you will never know whether you have those biases already built in, and we don't know if Descartes did. But the notion that only seeing himself in the world and no one else, even that is, at the very least, Eurocentric, and that is a problem. Okay, so Bacon and Descartes are coexisting. They're both really important, but each work in a different mode, right? We've got rational thinking, deductive reasoning, Descartes, and we have empirical thinking and inductive reasoning, which is Bacon. So both thinkers rigorously questioned philosophy, scientific authority of the ancient Greeks. They rewrite and reorganize the scientific method under radically new lines, and not so willing to accept ancient authorities. They are looking to critique, right, these pre-existing natural philosophies. Yes, they were necessary. We have to start somewhere. But if science is coming back for the first time here, we need to consider this new world that is going to try to understand. Because by this point, we do have primitive telescopes, primitive microscopes, we have sextants, we have devices that allow us to measure and basically measure reality. This is something the pre-Socratics didn't have. And if you can measure reality, you can apply you can apply mathematical ideas to that world in order to make sense of it. And Bacon reminded us, just because we're using mathematics and algebra doesn't mean it exists in reality. It exists in our own minds as a method, as a way to make sense of reality. So we have them questioning the ancients, questioning pre-existing natural philosophy, saying that the new scientific method is going to be radically different. And for Descartes, he was rational and theoretical, and Bacon was practical and empirical. But that is essentially, in a nutshell, the different positions that each one of them took. And of course, both in their own way were concerned about how human beings attain and keep knowledge. Their methods were radically different, but they were both concerned with the same thing. How can we achieve knowledge? Now, Descartes thought radical doubt was the way to go, especially if we're thinking about our sense perceptions. Funny how Descartes was always focused on sense perception as being problematic, never thought about his own mind being skeptical, his own mind being prejudiced or biased or having blind spots. And this is where Bacon is the more intuitive of the two. Descartes, yes, talks about radical doubt pertaining perception, but Bacon, in his New Science, says, look, our minds can be conflicting in the same way. We may have these, what he calls them idols, right? Idols of the tribe, idols of the marketplace. All of these idols that we fall under the sway of will color our thinking. So as much as Bacon was saying, yes, Cartesian thinking does have its merits, but it has its limits. And Bacon says, no, these idols that we're under the sway of can then turn around and force us to missee or misthink an idea. We're not thinking clearly because we have a prejudice we're not even aware of. To me, that is one of Bacon's most remarkable ideas. When we have our Zoom for this week, I'll show you some of the ideas that he presents that are surprisingly absolutely relevant right now. Because the sway that people have, the fact we end up in these algorithmic bubbles, courtesy of Twitter and Facebook, the way in which we end up in groups of like-minded people who are themselves not thinking clearly, that is very dangerous to our cogito, right? Our ability to think. If we're not willing to cast radical doubt on our capacity to think, but only our capacity to sense things, that's only half the battle. But Bacon had already figured this out. So, while Descartes, who favored deduction, going from large to small or general to specific, Bacon preferred induction, which is specific to general. And so you have particulars that are first examined, and then we move on to a gradual ascent of more and more general and universal truths. And that is really the main but still very crucial difference between the way in which these two individuals think. So Descartes, wide to small or general to particular, which is inductive. And then we've got Bacon, who is moving from the particular to the general, or inductive thinking. My mistake. The ability of the human senses to transmit information correctly. Both of these individuals also knew that there were some problems there. So yes, Bacon also thought that the ability of the cogito to figure out truth by itself could be tricked, diluted, misinformed. This is something Descartes doesn't address. Right? This is a fundamental difference between these two. So we have Descartes' deductive reasoning, Bacon's inductive reasoning, and both of them still willing to not blindly accept the senses, right? Each of them looks for a particular way in which we can trust our senses, but not blindly. We do it by testing and testing again. So there's a difference between these two thinkers. There's a difference in the way in which they access truth, whether it's capital T truth, an absolute truth, or a conditional truth, which would be a lowercase t, sometimes even in quotations. So Descartes thought that we could grasp absolute truth, which is a kind of hubris, right? A kind of pride that I don't know if that is ever possible. Bacon was much more conciliatory to this idea. He thought that, look, that kind of a goal is unlikely, but we can certainly aim at it. And if we can use truth as a guide, right? And we do that by constantly testing and retesting our hypotheses, our premises. So if we can do that, and if we know that an absolute truth may not be possible, a conditional truth is still very reasonable. And if we can do that for the time being until some new data comes along, we're going to be okay. Now, the third person I want to look at here in the second half is Galileo Galilei, and typically known as by his name Galileo, his first one. And he is more of an astronomer than anything else. He's a physicist, an engineer, also a philosopher, also a mathematician. And he is one of these individuals that ran afoul of the Italian church, because in the same way that in Germany and England, civil wars kind of repositioned the power of the church as being part of the social fabric, but Italy and France had a much more powerful Catholic church that really were in charge of the marketplace of ideas. Whether Giordano Bruno, Galileo, some of these individuals and others, many others suffered at the hands of the church because they dared to disagree with the church. So we know Galileo because of the work that he was doing in science and this revolutionary kind of thinking, especially in terms of astronomy, right? He had also done physics and so on, but he is really known for his work in astronomy. And the most important thing he came up with is his belief in heliocentrism. Now, what is that? It is the idea that the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun at the center of the solar system. Okay, that sounds like it's pretty logical. We're not even talking about whether or not the Earth is flat or any strange ideas such as Thales thinking that the Earth floats in water, which is not bizarre given not having a telescope. If you look across the horizon and if you're on the shoreline, yeah, it looks like water. Water recedes almost into the sky. Here, Galileo believed that the Earth and the rest of the planets that they could see because they had telescopes actually revolved around the sun. And this was absolutely controversial because if you can imagine the church thinking that we as individuals, as God's chosen race, we are the center of the universe. So here is an idea realized in reality that the church was thinking that we are geocentric. The idea that the Earth is at the center of all celestial bodies. Well, sorry, but we're not, right? And it was Galileo who was the first person. Now, Copernicus, without going too far out, Copernicus was also thinking the same way and was writing almost 100 years prior. For some reason, Copernicus did not suffer the same fate as Galileo, but they really essentially said the same thing. The fact that the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun as heliocentrism. The church, on the other hand, believed in geocentrism, right? The center. The Earth is the center, when in fact that was not the case. And so Galileo was eventually investigated in 1615, and the Roman Inquisition, because they're full of smarty men, thought that heliocentrism was foolish and absurd. It was a foolish philosophical concept and bordering on heretical positions in terms of the Holy Scripture. This is why we make this 1500-year jump from Aristotle to now. Because for 1500 years, all philosophy does is try to prove in one way or another the existence of God over and over and over again. It doesn't move knowledge forward by any means. And even if it did, if these philosophers disagreed even slightly with Scripture, with religious teachings, with theology, they were often killed because the church could. The church had the mandate because it ran the show. So this is why I take a huge leap from Aristotle to this. It's like, okay, well, what happened? To be honest, that's a reason why it was called the Dark Ages. Not a whole lot happened. And these things I find much more interesting because these are historically important ideas, not just philosophical. So when I look at the history of philosophy, I like to tie it very integrally to historical developments, social and political developments. And here is really the next thing that comes along. We had Aristotle and then Aristotelian thought for 1500 years used at the service of the church. And then finally we have people thinking and stepping up to the plate and thinking scientifically. And this is what happens. The Roman Inquisition of 1615 turns around and says that Galileo is wrong, that it's foolish and absurd, and that is heretical. And as you can imagine, this made life for Galileo very, very difficult. So there was an opposition to heliocentrism because in the Bible it said that the world is firmly established, it cannot move. And Psalm 104 also said, the Lord set the earth on its foundations, it can never be moved. This was the scientific reasoning for geocentrism. The fact that the earth cannot be moved because it was in the Bible. So Galileo says, no, I'm sorry, but I don't see this. I see the opposite. So he tried to defend heliocentrism based on observation. And he was doing this as early as 1609. So 6 years later, after arguing this point, he's hauled up in front of the Roman Inquisition, and they say, no, you're wrong. So Galileo was arguing that heliocentrism, it was not actually contrary to biblical text. It was perhaps maybe a too rigorous reading of this notion of movement and non-movement, stability and instability. He says, look, the Bible was an authority on faith and morals, right? So in and of itself, it contains parables about how to live your life, but it was not the most effective when it came to science. And so this is why Galileo was trying to, in a sense, have it both ways. Say, look, I'm not saying I disbelieve the Bible. I believe that it is an authority on faith and morals, which is what it is, but it's not an effective piece of literature in terms of science. So prior to that, educated people either thought that Aristotle is a geocentric view, right? Even he thought it was. And this is, again, another example of doubting the authority of ancient figures, right? Doubting the authority of individuals like Aristotle, who also believed that geocentrism was correct. And so Copernicus in 1543, so let's say about a half a century prior, at that time it wasn't considered uncontroversial because it did not come up against a question of power. And power that the church had was unquestioned. It was absolute. At the time Copernicus is writing, and of course he's not living in Italy, he's living elsewhere, this issue doesn't come up because it's not a power struggle between two ways of viewing the world. In France and in France and in Italy, it absolutely is. So any opposition to geocentrism, such as Galileo's ideas of heliocentrism, really was fueled by political events. It was a power struggle. And again, this is why my history of philosophy is anchored in reality, anchored in events. And so the opposition that the church had to Galileo's ideas of heliocentrism were really fueled by political events and power struggles between Galileo and the church. And so in 1615, when Galileo was up in front of the Roman Inquisition, they claimed that Galileo was trying to reinterpret the Bible. And he said, no, I just finished telling you. It's about faith and morality, and it is unquestionably about that. But for science, no. And of course, the Catholic Church in Italy was saying, look, are we moving towards a kind of Protestantism? In other words, we're protesting, right? It is a protest against the beliefs. That's the kind of political events that the church was looking at Galileo trying to start. And no, he wasn't trying to start a new religion. He was merely a scientist, right? An astronomer who saw something and kept testing it over and over again and going, I'm sorry, but this is what I see. So he went to try to defend himself, and the Inquisition said, okay, no, this is wrong. It is geocentric. The earth is stationary. Everything revolves around it. And needless to say, eventually over time, Galileo was proven right. So the notion of abandoning heliocentrism was something that Galileo had to do, right? They told him, said, you need to set this aside. So he was officially ordered by the church, by the Roman Catholic Church, quote, to abandon completely the opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and the earth moves, and henceforth not to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatsoever, either orally or in writing. So if you have any doubts as to what I mean by the absolute power that the church had in the marketplace of ideas, here it is. Here it is, right there. So Cardinal Bellarmine, all right, Pope Paul the Fifth. That is Pope Paul. I mean, the Pope is the highest figure in on earth for the Roman Catholic Church, and is ordering him to stop talking about it, to not teach it, to not defend it, to not hold that thought any way whatsoever. And they essentially silenced him. Now, Galileo, at a later point, tried to defend his heliocentric views a little bit later on in dialogues concerning the two chief world systems. And again, it was looked at politically. It was misinterpreted as an attack on the Pope, Pope Urban VIII, and fellow Jesuits. And once again, he dragged into the Roman Inquisition. He was charged with heresy. He was forced to recant his observations. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. But even under house arrest, right, thankfully he wasn't killed, because Bruno suffered a far worse fate, which was to be burned alive at the stake. And other scientists and philosophers suffered equally horrible fates. But Galileo was lucky, absolutely lucky, that he was only under house arrest, which was unpleasant to begin with. But at least under house arrest, he remained alive. And he was able to continue writing and publishing some of his works, including one of the most important ones, Two New Sciences, in 1638. So notice Discourse on Method, the New Science, other science texts, discourses, mathematical demonstrations to new sciences. These are the ideas, and these are the books that really represent very accurately, in my mind, that scientific push away from theological thinking. In the same way as in the ancient world, it was mythological thinking. These are the individuals that made this happen. So the Roman Inquisition had banned the publication of all of Galileo's works, but interestingly enough, Galileo was able to smuggle out a copy of Two New Sciences to Holland, where it was published, and where the Inquisition was much less influential. Again, Galileo had to get his work published in Holland. Descartes had to basically hide in Belgium in order to get his work done. And these weren't the only individuals. There were other philosophers who had to write anonymously or had to hide out in Holland because it was more tolerant. But this is how these people managed to survive, and how their texts were able to survive for us to read today. So Two New Sciences was published in Holland and then brought back into the rest of Western Europe. And Galileo himself was lucky enough not to suffer any undue harm, even when the book came out in 1639. So 1615, he's told to basically pipe down, and about, say, 20 plus years later, he writes a new book where he defends exactly the same thing, but not much happens, right? They just kind of let it go. And shortly after Galileo died, right, the charges of heresy were forgotten. They were basically lifted. The Inquisition ban on Galileo's books was lifted in 1718, and there was permission granted in Italy to publish editions of his work. And by 1758, which is roughly 100 years later, the ban against works advocating heliocentrism completely removed from the index of prohibited books. And all of a sudden, heliocentrism was just there. It was just an idea. And all official opposition to heliocentrism by 1835 completely gone. And the works in the plural were finally dropped by the index. So we have the church looking to score political points by trying to silence someone who knew in their heart of hearts that they were right. And somehow, within that 100 years, the church came to the same conclusion. But rather than officially make an announcement, it just quietly got rid of the charges of heresy, quietly got rid of any mentions of heliocentrism as wrong, and then finally quietly removed all of his books off the index of prohibited books. So it is a remarkable change, a remarkable turnaround by the church towards not even critics, but just scientists and philosophers who were viewed as heretical, right? Their works were filled with heresy and heretical thoughts that were counterintuitive to the Bible, and yet each one of them, Descartes was a believer, Galileo was a believer, but they were also scientists and saying, no, we need to look at this differently. So Galileo was someone that certainly, as an astronomer, had perhaps one of the most profound ideas that ran counterintuitive to traditional understandings of Scripture, and which was that the Earth did not stand still in the middle of the solar system, but was one of many planets that circulated around the sun. It was as simple as that. Okay, so thanks for listening to all of this. Sorry to go on, but this information is very important. And we will wrap this up here. We'll see each other next week. We'll have a Zoom meeting, of course, but we'll see each other next week for more. So we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.